White CEO calls black wife dumb at wedding. Her clapback destroys him before 200 guests. Subscribe for more stories. I would like to propose a toast. Every head on the rooftop of the Chateau Marmont swiveled in unison, with all eyes fixed on the serene, steady voice that sliced through the uncomfortable quiet. Amara Johnson stood there in a gown of emerald silk, the shimmer of tears still on her cheeks from the public mortification inflicted by her husband. She held her phone in a single, perfectly manicured hand, while a cryptic smile touched her lips. Some guests whispered with sympathy, while others averted their gazes in secondhand shame. Someone quietly uttered that William had truly crossed a line this time. But Amara showed no sign of faltering. The words she spoke next would do more than just devastate him. They would unmask the greatest corporate secret California had ever known. The October air of Beverly Hills was fragrant with jasmine and luxurious perfumes as Amara Johnson smoothed the emerald silk gown that clung flawlessly to her form. The rooftop of the Chateau Marmont was a spectacle of crystal chandeliers and white roses, the setting for what Forbes would later dub the wedding of the decade. Technology magnate Trevor Kane had spared no cost for his marriage to supermodel Elena Volov, and the attendees represented the pinnacle of California's business world. Amara moved among the guests with polished grace, her deep mahogany skin glowing in the gentle light. At 34, she had a serene elegance that commanded attention, with high cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, perceptive dark eyes that seemed to take in everything, and her natural hair sculpted into a sophisticated updo, highlighting diamond earrings that cost more than most cars. She carried her confidence like a suit of armor, although on this night, it felt exceptionally brittle. "There she is, my stunning wife." William Hartwell's voice boomed as he drew near, his words already loosened by scotch. At 39, William was an imposing man in his custom-tailored Tom Ford suit. He had a tall, athletic frame maintained by a personal trainer, eyes the color of steel, and immaculately styled blonde hair that spoke of inherited wealth and privilege. He was the type of man who dominated boardrooms and country club discussions with the same effortless authority. William, Amara's smile was warm yet guarded. After 8 years of marriage, she could interpret his moods as easily as forecasting the weather, and a storm was clearly gathering tonight. "Come, I want you to meet the partners from the Blackstone Group," he declared, his hand pressing possessively into the small of her back. "They're talking about the Henderson merger." As they neared the group of men in their high-priced suits, Amara instantly recognized the influential figures: Gerald Murphy from Goldman Sachs, tech visionary Brad Shun, and real estate titan Antonio Rivera. These were the men who molded the state's economy through handshake agreements and negotiations on private jets. "Gentlemen, you all recall my wife, Amara," William announced with an inflection she had come to loathe, one that presented her as little more than an adornment. "Of course," Gerald acknowledged with a polite nod. "William, we were just going over the new AI regulations. Your perspective on the technology sector has been priceless." William's chest visibly swelled. 20 years building Hartwell Industries from nothing teaches you a few things about market dynamics. Amara took a sip of her champagne and listened, her mind instinctively analyzing the implications of their talk. The men spoke of billion-dollar transactions with a casual air, their words shaping entire industries. She could have offered valuable perspectives, given her Harvard MBA in international business and a secret portfolio of acquisitions that gave her insights they couldn't fathom. But she had long since accepted that her input was not welcome in these circles. "The real key is a deep understanding of global supply chains," Williams said, his voice amplifying with every drink. "Most people just can't wrap their minds around the complexity. Most people," Amara mused, or most women who looked like her. The discussion soon shifted to more casual subjects as other couples joined their group. Elena Kane, looking ethereal in her Vera Wang dress, approached with Trevor, both of them radiant with newlywed bliss. "This party is just spectacular," Patricia Chun, Brad's wife, exclaimed, her sequin red dress glittering in the light. "Elena, you have surpassed all expectations," Elena laughed, her Russian accent lending an exotic quality to her words. Trevor managed most of the business side. I simply focused on the aesthetics, a smart way to divide the work, noted Gerald's wife, Margaret. Playing to one's strengths, that phrase hung in the air, seemingly innocent, yet Amara felt William's demeanor shift beside her. She knew that specific tension, the point where his compulsion to assert dominance would override his better judgment. Speaking of playing to strengths, William stated, his voice now projecting across the circle. That's the foundation of a successful partnership. Understanding one's role, several heads turned to face them. A knot began to form in Amara's stomach. Absolutely, Brad chimed in. In business and in marriage, you must have clear responsibilities. Precisely, William carried on, encouraged by the focus on him. Take Amara and me. I'm the one who handles the intricate business strategy. She takes care of, he made a vague gesture, the other things. The atmosphere in the group subtly changed. Amara felt the weight of eyes on her, some with pity, others with curiosity. This was a familiar pattern. The moment William's light condescension was about to escalate, if not skillfully managed. William, she murmured, attempting to steer the conversation away. What is it, darling? His smile was now sharp, a perilous mix of alcohol and an audience. I'm merely explaining our dynamic to our friends. Sensing the rising tension, Trevor tried to step in. Marriage is certainly about being a team. Elena and I are still finding our own rhythm, but William was beyond being subtly swayed. The discussion of the merger had activated his competitive nature, and he felt a need to cement his standing in the social pecking order. The reality is, he went on, his voice now carrying distinctly across the rooftop, that some people are born to lead and others are born to follow. It's not a matter of intelligence. Well, not entirely. It's about possessing the right kind of intellect for complex thought. The champagne flute felt leaden in Amara's hand. All around them, other conversations were starting to quiet down as William's voice became more pronounced. William, perhaps we should, she started. No, this is vital. He cut her off, his gray eyes shining with a particular cruelty that surfaced when he drank. People must grasp how successful partnerships truly function. The circle was now entirely fixed on their exchange, and other guests were beginning to pick up on the strained mood. Amara could feel the familiar burn of humiliation rising in her chest, but something else was also brewing, a cold, methodical rage she had contained for years. A light breeze rustled her gown as she stood on the brink of a moment that would alter everything. William's mouth was opening once more, and she knew with a sickening feeling that his next words would cross a boundary from which there was no return. The wedding festivities carried on around them, with the clinking of glasses and laughter drifting through the Beverly Hills night. But within their circle, the air was thick with expectation. Amara could feel destiny converging like a storm, and for the first time in a long while, she wasn't certain she wanted to shield William from the impending strike of lightning. The moment stretched out as William swirled the scotch in his glass, relishing the focus of California's elite. The rooftop's ambient lighting drew shadows across his face, making his recognizable features seem almost predatory. Amara observed him with the detached fascination of someone watching a car wreck in slow motion, appalled but unable to turn away. You see, William went on, his voice infused with the self-assurance gained from years of boardroom triumphs. Marriage functions best when both partners acknowledge their inherent abilities. Some minds are made for strategy, others for, he trailed off, looking for the appropriate words as his audience waited in uncomfortable silence. Amara felt her heart rate accelerate. The champagne flute in her hand felt like it weighed a ton. Around them, the party continued. A string quartet played a familiar classical piece as servers moved among the guests with silver trays of hors d'oeuvres. But their group had become an island of unease in a sea of celebration. William, she whispered, her voice barely a breath above the music. It was a final caution, a last opportunity for him to retreat from the precipice he was nearing. He either failed to hear her or deliberately disregarded the entreaty in her voice. The fact is, he declared, his gray eyes glinting with a distinct cruelty unleashed by alcohol, not everyone is equipped to handle complex business talks. Some individuals are better suited to simpler duties. Gerald Murphy shifted his weight uneasily. His wife, Margaret, suddenly found her champagne flute intensely interesting. Even Trevor Kane, who is normally unflappable in social settings, looked as if he wished he could vanish into the night. But William was beyond interpreting social signals. The merger discussion had ignited his competitive drive, and he needed to assert his position as the alpha in their relationship. He was about to set off an explosion that would obliterate everything they had created. "Take my lovely wife here," he said, his hand landing on Amara's waist with a familiar sense of ownership. "She's beautiful, charming, a perfect hostess. But when it comes to business strategy or complicated negotiations, well, let's just say we each have our own talents." The circle fell completely silent. Patricia Chin looked at her husband Brad, as if willing him to step in. Elena Kane's face had gone crimson beneath her expert makeup, and her new husband's hand tightened around her waist in a protective gesture. Amara felt a familiar numbness seep into her chest, the same protective detachment she had honed in her childhood when her foster parents discussed her future as if she weren't there. But beneath that numbness, something else was awakening, something cold, exact, and utterly merciless. "Will, that's enough," Trevor finally interjected, his voice imbued with the authority of a man worth $3 billion. "Maybe we should—" No, this is important," William insisted, his voice rising above the string quartet. "People need to understand how partnerships operate in the real world." He turned to Bradshaw, searching for masculine support. "You get it, right? In business, you need people who can think 3 steps ahead, who can perceive the entire picture. Strategic thinking isn't something one can just pretend to have." Brad's expression became carefully neutral, the look of a man who had made his fortune by knowing when to keep quiet. But William took his silence as affirmation. "Exactly," William went on, his voice now echoing across several conversations. Heads began to turn throughout the rooftop as his words pierced the sophisticated atmosphere like shattering glass. Some people possess that kind of analytical mind, and others— he motioned toward Amara with a casual wave of his hand— well, others are better at different things. The humiliation was a known feeling, but its public display felt like being flayed alive. Amara had weathered 8 years of subtle condescension, of being introduced merely as William's wife, of having her Harvard MBA brushed aside as cute, and her business acumen disregarded. But this was a new level of deliberate cruelty, a performance for their peers. He was actually savoring this. She understood with stark clarity. He was deriving pleasure from belittling her in front of these people. Gerald Murphy made one final attempt at damage control. "William, perhaps this is a conversation for a more private setting. Why?" William's laugh was sharp and harsh. "We're all adults. We all know how things work. Some people are designed for high-level strategic thought, and others are not. It's not an insult. It's just a fact." He turned to face Amara directly, his gray eyes locking with hers in a way that mingled fondness and condescension, making her stomach churn. The entire rooftop seemed to hold its breath. "Darling," he said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of their circle and beyond, "why don't you tell everyone about the time you tried to explain cryptocurrency to the Hendersons? Remember how confused you became with all those technical terms?" Several people in their group audibly gasped. Margaret Murphy looked as though she wanted to hide under the nearest table. Elena Kane's face was white with sympathetic horror. But William hadn't finished. The alcohol and the audience had unleashed a viciousness in him, a need to assert his dominance that overrode all instincts for self-preservation. "Or even better," he continued, his smile sharp enough to slice diamonds, "perhaps Amara should offer a toast to the newlyweds. Stand up and address everyone." His pause was dramatic, calculated for maximum effect. "Oh, wait. She's not sharp enough to string a sentence together without stumbling over her own words." The words struck Amara like a series of physical blows. Around them, the elegant party went on. Crystal glasses chimed, Laughter floated on the October air, and the string quartet transitioned to a piece by Mozart. But in their circle, time stood still. She felt something shatter inside her. It wasn't her heart, that had been fracturing for years under the weight of William's casual cruelty. No, this was something more profound. It was the complete annihilation of the woman who had spent 8 years making herself smaller, quieter, and less formidable to safeguard a man's ego. The tears came without warning, hot and shameful on her cheeks. She tried to blink them away, but they fell nonetheless, landing on the emerald silk of her dress like liquid diamonds in the party lights. "Amara," Elena Kane whispered, her voice filled with horror and empathy. William's expression changed as he finally noticed the devastation on his wife's face. For an instant, the cruelty in his eyes wavered, and something approaching regret flickered across his features. But it was far too late. The words had been spoken, witnessed by 200 of California's most influential figures. "Sweetheart, I didn't mean," he started, but Amara was already pulling back from his outstretched hand. "Excuse me," she whispered, her voice barely a murmur above the music and chatter. She turned from the circle, from the pitying faces and strained silence, from the man who had just emotionally destroyed her in front of everyone who mattered in their world. As she moved toward the edge of the rooftop terrace, a different feeling began to build within her. The numbness was receding, replaced by a cold, calculating fury she had meticulously suppressed for years. William believed he had just put her in her place, demonstrated to their social circle precisely who held the power in their relationship. He has no idea, she thought, her tears drying as a harder resolve took their place. He thinks intelligence is about making others feel small. He's about to find out what intelligence truly looks like. She reached the terrace railing and gripped it, her knuckles white. Below, the lights of Beverly Hills twinkled like a carpet of fallen stars, and beyond, the vast expanse of Los Angeles stretched to the ocean. Out there lay her empire, the one William knew nothing about. "You want to see me speak in public?" she thought, turning back toward the party with a predatory glint in her dark eyes. "You want to see if I can string a sentence together? Let me show you exactly what your dumb wife is capable of." The transformation was complete. The woman who had walked away in tears was gone, replaced by someone William had never met, someone who was about to teach him that underestimating her was the gravest mistake of his life. Amara stood at the terrace railing for precisely 90 seconds, just long enough for her tears to evaporate and for something far more potent to take their place. The October wind brought the sounds of strained conversation from behind her, the stilted laughter of people trying to act as if they hadn't just witnessed a social catastrophe. She could sense the eyes on her back, a blend of pity and curiosity from California's elite, who were already crafting the narratives they would share at brunch the next day. She turned around slowly, her actions deliberate and measured. The emerald silk gown that had been her armor earlier now felt like war paint. Her reflection in the glass doors revealed a transformed woman. The gentle vulnerability William had exploited for 8 years had been replaced by something sharp and unforgiving. The party continued its elaborate performance around the wreckage William had created. Waitstaff still moved among the guests with champagne and canapes. The string quartet had transitioned to Vivaldi, their music floating through the night like effervescent bubbles. But the atmosphere had soured. Conversations were laced with tension, and she saw people casting furtive glances toward their corner of the rooftop. William stood right where she had left him, his scotch glass clutched in his hand like a lifeline. His face was pale beneath his tan, the cruel confidence of moments ago replaced by the dawning understanding that he might have made a terrible miscalculation. "There's nothing to take a moment about," Amara said, her voice ringing with clarity as she rejoined them. The tears were gone. The trembling had ceased. In their place was a woman who had just made a life-altering decision. William's relief was palpable. "Darling, I'm sorry if I don't," the single word sliced through his apology. "Don't apologize. Don't try to explain. Don't make this any worse than it already is." She turned to the circle of onlookers, these titans of industry who managed billions of dollars and thousands of lives. Gerald Murphy with his Goldman Sachs influence, Brad Chun with his tech empire, Antonio Rivera with his real estate dynasty. These were the men who molded California's economy in private conversations. Actually, she went on, her voice gathering power with every word, I think William has a point. Some people are natural leaders, and others are natural followers. Some minds are built for strategic thinking, and others, she paused, allowing his own words to hang in the air like a toxin, are built for making assumptions. Trevor Kane shifted uneasily. His new wife, Elena, held his arm, her model's intuition sensing a dramatic turn in the night's events. Amara, William said quietly, a warning note in his voice. But it was too late for warnings. The damage had been inflicted, and now it was time for the fallout. You know, the most fascinating thing about strategic thinking, she posed, her eyes moving deliberately around the circle, is that it requires data. Real information, not assumptions founded on. How did you phrase it, William? Natural capabilities? Margaret Murphy shot a look at her husband. They had both seen enough boardroom takeovers to know the signs of an impending execution. Amara reached into her small Hermes clutch, a purse that cost more than a month's salary for most people, and took out her phone. The simple act felt weighted with inevitability. I've been considering giving a toast, she announced, her voice possessing the calm that often precedes a storm. William suggested I might not be able to string a sentence together, but I think I'll give it a try. Amara, please. William's voice was now laced with desperation. 8 years of marriage had taught him to read her moods, but this was new, uncharted territory. The woman before him was a stranger, controlled, resolute, and completely devoid of the deference he had come to expect. Please what? She inquired, tilting her head with an air of genuine curiosity. Please don't embarrass you the way you just embarrassed me. Please don't speak in public, because I might say something simple. She turned her gaze to the broader party, scanning the crowd of powerful faces. Media magnates and tech founders, real estate developers and investment bankers, politicians and entertainment executives. 200 of California's most influential people were gathered to celebrate love and new chapters. How fitting, she thought grimly. They were about to witness a very different kind of new beginning. I believe a toast is precisely what this party needs, she proclaimed, her voice projecting clearly across the rooftop. Something to truly commemorate the happy couple. And new discoveries, several servers paused mid-stride, sensing the atmospheric shift. Conversations began to die down as word spread that something significant was unfolding near the terrace. The string quartet kept playing, but their melody now seemed to highlight rather than conceal the mounting tension. William seized her arm, his grip tight enough to bruise. Don't do this, he hissed, his voice low and insistent. Whatever you are planning, don't. She glanced down at his hand on her arm, then back to his face. The silence between them was thick with 8 years of accumulated resentment and the specific cruelty of the last 10 minutes. Let go of me, she said quietly, but her tone held a note of absolute command that made him release her instantly. Brad Chun cleared his throat. Maybe we should all— No. Amara cut in, her focus fixed on William's increasingly pale face. I think we should stay right here. I think everyone should hear what William's intellectually inferior wife has to say. She saw the exact moment William understood he had unleashed something beyond his control. His gray eyes widened with a mix of fear and dawning awareness. He knew her well enough to recognize that whatever she did next would be devastating, but he couldn't possibly imagine the true scale of the destruction she was about to unleash. You see, she continued, her voice carrying to the growing crowd of spectators, William is absolutely correct about strategic thinking. It does require seeing the larger picture, planning multiple moves ahead, and understanding complex market dynamics. She paused, letting her words sink in among the increasingly silent guests. The string quartet had ceased playing, their instruments resting as they, too, felt the dramatic tension building. The question is, she said, her dark eyes locked on her husband's face, who exactly has been doing that strategic thinking in our marriage? William's Scotch glass trembled in his hand. Around them, their circle of witnesses had expanded as more guests drifted over, lured by the unmistakable energy of social earthquake. "Darling," he attempted one last time, his voice holding a pleading note she had never heard. "Let's discuss this in private, privately." Amara's laugh was soft and utterly devoid of warmth. "After you just humiliated me in front of 200 people? After you called me too stupid to speak in public? No, William. I think the public deserves to hear what your simple-minded wife has been doing while you've been handling all those complex business decisions." She turned to the crowd, her posture straightening with resolve. The deferential wife was gone, replaced by someone William was meeting for the very first time. "Ladies and gentlemen," she called out, her voice ringing across the rooftop, "if I could have your attention for just a moment, I'd like to propose a toast to the happy couple and to the power of underestimating people." The party had fallen completely silent now. 200 faces turned toward her, their expressions a mix of fascination, horror, and anticipation. William stood frozen beside her, his face ashen, realizing he was about to discover just how wrong he had been about everything. Amara raised her champagne flute to the crowd, her smile sharp enough to cut diamonds. "This ought to be interesting," she murmured, just loudly enough for William to hear. "Let's see how well your strategic mind handles the next few minutes." The silence on the Chateau Marmont rooftop was so absolute that the distant drone of traffic on Sunset Boulevard sounded thunderous. 200 of California's most powerful figures stood frozen, their champagne flutes glinting under the crystal chandeliers as they awaited the unfolding drama. Amara was at the center of it all, her emerald silk dress catching the breeze as she held her glass high. The tearful woman from 15 minutes prior had vanished, replaced by someone who exuded a quiet, perilous confidence that made the air crackle. "First," she started, her voice carrying across the rooftop without effort, "let me say how honored William and I are to celebrate the union of Trevor and Elena tonight. A true partnership, built on mutual respect and the recognition of each other's strengths, is a beautiful thing to behold." The words were like precisely aimed daggers. Elena Kane clutched her new husband's arm, her model's intuition recognizing the veiled attack in the gracious words. Trevor's face became carefully impassive, the look of a billionaire accustomed to weathering sudden storms. William stood beside her like a statue, his Scotch glass forgotten in his white-knuckled hand. The self-assurance that had guided him through decades of negotiations had vanished, replaced by the dawning horror of a man realizing he'd been playing checkers while his opponent was playing an entirely different game. "Marriage," Amara went on, her dark eyes surveying the crowd of influential faces, "is a fascinating institution when you consider it. Two people, ostensibly sharing everything, finances, dreams, daily choices, in complete transparency and partnership." She paused, letting her eyes drift deliberately to William's increasingly pale face. "At least, that is the theory." Gerald Murphy shifted uneasily, his investment banker's gut telling him he was about to witness a corporate hostile takeover disguised as a wedding speech. His wife, Margaret, had gone completely still, recognizing the energy that precedes social ruin. "William and I have been married for 8 wonderful years," Amara stated, her voice imbued with false warmth. "During that time, he has built Hartwell Industries into what many see as one of California's most successful tech consulting firms. 230 employees, offices in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and San Diego. Quite an achievement," the crowd murmured in polite assent. Hartwell Industries was respected in tech circles, though not on the level of the true giants present. "What William may not have mentioned," she continued, her smile turning sharper, "is that his lovely, simple-minded wife has also been keeping herself occupied." The temperature on the rooftop seemed to plunge. Antonio Rivera, the real estate mogul, leaned forward slightly, his developer's sense recognizing the moment a foundation was about to crack. William finally spoke. "Amara, whatever you're thinking," she turned to him with genuine wonder. "But darling, you just finished telling everyone that thinking, real strategic thinking, isn't my forte. So this can't be thinking." This must be something else. She turned back to the crowd, her champagne glass catching the light as she gestured elegantly. You see, while William has been managing the complex business decisions in our home, I've been cultivating some hobbies, little projects to keep me busy. Patricia Chun, Brad's wife, whispered something urgently to him. The tech entrepreneur's face had sharpened with focus, recognizing the tone of someone about to drop a very expensive bomb. For instance, Amara said, pulling her phone from her clutch with casual precision, about 6 months ago, I developed a keen interest in renewable energy. You know how we simple folks are drawn to straightforward ideas like sunshine and wind. She swiped across her phone screen with the ease of someone accessing familiar information, which is how I came to acquire a controlling interest in Pacific Solar Dynamics. A lovely company. They provide the solar infrastructure for about 40% of California's residential market. The silence that followed was immense. Pacific Solar Dynamics was a multi-billion-dollar corporation whose stock performance could sway entire sectors of the green energy market. William's Scotch glass slipped from his grasp, shattering on the stone floor with a sound like breaking crystal. That's impossible, he whispered. Is it? Amara asked, her voice carrying just enough feigned innocence to be devastating. I suppose I should have said something, but you were always so occupied with your strategic thinking. I didn't want to trouble you with my little hobby projects. Trevor Kane stepped forward slightly, his billionaire instincts finally trumping social etiquette. Amara, are you telling us you own Pacific Solar? Controlling interest, she corrected with a modest smile. 67%, to be exact. Though I suppose that distinction requires the kind of analytical thought that she gestured vaguely, mimicking William's earlier dismissiveness. Well, you understand. The crowd was starting to buzz. Cell phones were emerging as people frantically checked stock prices and business registries. Margaret Murphy was already Googling Pacific Solar Dynamics, her face paling with each search result. William grabbed her arm again, his grip now desperate. This is crazy. You don't have that kind of money. We share accounts. I would have noticed share accounts. Amara's laugh was musical and completely devoid of warmth. Oh, darling, we share some accounts. The ones you know about. But you've been so busy telling people how I'm not suited for complex financial matters that I didn't want to burden you with the details of my trust fund investments. The word struck William like a physical assault. His face went through a cycle of confusion, denial, and dawning horror as the implications settled in. Trust fund? He echoed numbly. Did I forget to mention that? She asked with devastating innocence. My apologies. Sometimes I get confused about what I've shared and what I haven't. You know how scattered we simple folks can be. Elena Kane was gripping her husband's arm so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The model-turned-billionaire's wife knew a masterclass in social warfare when she saw it. Amara turned back to the crowd, her phone still glowing in her hand. But renewable energy is just one of my small interests. I've also developed a fascination with California's agricultural sector. Did you know that Central Valley Produce Corporation manages about 35% of the state's organic farming distribution? She paused, letting the information sink into the increasingly stunned audience. They do now anyway, since I acquired them last month. Another one of those simple, direct investments that appeal to minds like mine. Antonio Rivera was typing furiously on his phone, cross-referencing business databases with the speed of a man whose entire worldview was being dismantled in real time. His face was ashen as the results confirmed her claims. Impossible, William repeated, but his voice lacked any conviction. The man who had shamed his wife for lacking strategic insight was beginning to see that he had been completely outplayed by someone he had dismissed as intellectually inferior. Oh, but we're just getting started, Amara said, her smile growing sharper with each disclosure. You see, I've found that I have quite a taste for. How did you put it, William? Complex business decisions. She swiped to another screen on her phone, her movements precise and assured. Which brings me to my latest acquisition. Something I completed just this afternoon. In fact, while you were at your very important lunch with the Henderson Group, the crowd pressed in, drawn by the unmistakable energy of history being made. This was no longer just a marital spat. This was a woman systematically unveiling an empire no one knew existed. William's face had turned gray with comprehension. "Amara, what did you do?" She looked at him with the patient affection one might show a slow child. "I diversified my portfolio, darling. After all, a girl needs hobbies to occupy her time while her brilliant husband handles all the real thinking." Her finger hovered over her phone screen, ready to deliver the next devastating revelation. The rooftop was so quiet that the sound of distant helicopters seemed to echo across Beverly Hills. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the party, "I'd like to share some news about my latest business venture. I think you'll find it quite educational." William closed his eyes, bracing himself. But nothing could have prepared him for what was coming. The anticipation on the rooftop was so dense you could feel it. 200 of California's most powerful people stood motionless in a moment destined for legend in boardrooms and country clubs. Amara held her phone like a scepter, her finger poised over the screen that would deal the final blow to everything William thought he knew. "You know," she began conversationally, her tone casual as if discussing weekend plans, "I've always been fascinated by the consulting industry. All those brilliant minds advising companies on efficiency, strategy, market positioning. It requires such sophisticated thinking to grasp how businesses truly function." William's breathing was shallow and quick. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening, and his hands trembled as he gripped the terrace railing for support. "Particularly fascinating," Amara continued, "are the larger firms that manage multiple clients across various sectors. The ones that truly comprehend the interconnected nature of California's business world." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the crowd of increasingly anxious faces. Gerald Murphy was typing frantically on his phone, his Goldman Sachs instincts screaming that a seismic shift in the state's power dynamics was underway. Brad Chun had gone completely still, his tech entrepreneur's mind racing through the consequences of her words. "Which leads me to my most recent acquisition," she said, her voice dropping to a tone that somehow carried across the silent rooftop. "A little company called Strategic Business Solutions Group. Perhaps some of you have heard of it." The collective gasp was audible. Strategic Business Solutions Group was one of California's largest consulting firms, with offices statewide and client contracts valued in the billions. They advised everyone from Fortune 500 corporations to government bodies on operational efficiency and strategic planning. Antonio Rivera actually stumbled backward, his phone clattering to the ground as the meaning hit him. That's impossible. SBSG is privately owned by a consortium of international investors operating through a Delaware corporation. Yes, I know. Amara finished for him. I set up that structure myself about 3 years ago. It's amazing what one can achieve when people assume you're too simple to understand complex financial instruments. Elena Kane was gripping her husband's arm so tightly that Trevor flinched. The supermodel's survival instincts told her she was witnessing the social equivalent of a nuclear blast. William's voice was a strangled whisper. 3 years? You've owned SBSG for 3 years. Controlling interest, she corrected with maternal patience. 78%, to be precise. Though I suppose mathematical accuracy is another one of those complex topics that might confuse someone like me. The crowd was fracturing as people pulled out phones and tablets, desperately cross-referencing databases. The implications were immense. If Amara Johnson controlled SBSG, she had access to the strategic plans of hundreds of major corporations. But here's the truly interesting part, she continued, her dark eyes fixed on William's horrified face. SBSG has been advising companies on acquisitions and mergers for the last 3 years. All those lovely reports about undervalued assets, market vulnerabilities, and the ideal timing for hostile takeovers. Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. You'd be amazed at how much strategic intelligence flows through a consulting firm that everyone trusts with their most sensitive planning. Margaret Murphy dropped her champagne flute, the crystal shattering with a sound like breaking dreams. You've been using insider information to build your empire, she breathed. Insider information? Amara tilted her head with feigned curiosity. Such an ugly phrase. I prefer to think of it as research, due diligence, the kind of thorough analysis that truly sophisticated thinkers use to make informed decisions. Trevor Kane stepped forward, his billionaire instincts finally overriding social decorum. Amara, what you're describing could be completely legal, she interrupted smoothly. I had the finest legal minds in California vet every acquisition, every investment, every corporate structure. You see, when SBSG advises Company A that Company B is undervalued, and then a completely separate entity, say a trust fund managed by offshore investment vehicles, acquires Company B 6 months later, there is no legal link. Just coincidence, the word hung in the air like a toxin. California's elite were beginning to grasp that they had been utterly outplayed by someone they had written off as a mere accessory. William's legs buckled, and he sank onto a stone bench. You've been planning this for years, he whispered. All those times I explained business concepts to you. All those meetings where you acted confused by financial talks, I was learning, she said simply. Watching, listening, understanding exactly how all of you thought, what you valued. Where blind spots where her laugh was soft and devoid of warmth. And your biggest blind spot, darling, was me. Brad Shun found his voice, though it was hoarse with shock. The Henderson Group deal, the one William has been working on for months. SBSG has been advising Henderson Group on their acquisition strategy since January, Amara confirmed. Fascinating company, Henderson Group. They're about to announce the largest private equity deal in California history. Something about acquiring undervalued tech consulting firms and merging them into a statewide powerhouse. William's head shot up, his gray eyes wide with dawning comprehension. No, you couldn't have what? She asked innocently. Couldn't have advised Henderson Group that Hartwell Industries would be a perfect acquisition target? Couldn't have given them detailed financial analysis on how to structure the takeover? Couldn't have ensured the acquisition would happen at precisely the right moment for maximum impact. The ensuing silence was deafening. William stared at his wife, as if for the first time, his mind struggling to grasp the scale of her orchestration. You see, Amara continued, her voice adopting the patient tone of a teacher explaining a difficult concept. While you were busy with the complex business decisions in our marriage, I was assembling the largest corporate empire in California's history. Pacific Solar Dynamics, Central Valley Produce Corporation, Strategic Business Solutions Group, and about 37 other companies you've never heard of, she began to count on her manicured fingers, each name a hammer blow. Northern California Real Estate Development, Bay Area Media Holdings, Sacramento Regional Banking Consortium, Orange County Manufacturing Collective. With each revelation, more phones appeared as people desperately tried to verify what they were hearing. The implications were staggering. If Amara controlled that many major companies, she wielded more economic power than most Fortune 500 CEOs. But my personal favorite, she said, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper that carried across the rooftop, is a little investment firm called Hartwell Capital Management. Funny name for a company your wife supposedly knows nothing about. Don't you think? William's face was completely white. That's impossible. I would have seen the paperwork. The corporate filings are all under my maiden name, through a series of Delaware shell corporations, she finished. Another one of those complex legal structures that apparently confused me too much to bother you. With the crowd pressed closer, drawn by the magnetic pull of witnessing absolute power revealed. This was no longer just a marital conflict. This was the emergence of a business empire that had been hiding in plain sight. Ladies and gentlemen, Amara announced, raising her glass to the stunned crowd, I'd like to propose a toast to the power of being underestimated, to the advantage of letting people think you're simple while you systematically acquire everything they think they own. She turned toward William, her dark eyes locking with his, like a predator who had finally cornered her prey. And to my dear husband, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the rooftop, who just learned that his intellectually inferior wife owns 91% of California's major corporations, including the one that's about to acquire his company tomorrow morning. The champagne flute shattered against the stone floor as William collapsed completely, the sound echoing across Beverly Hills like a crack of thunder. The crystalline shards of the champagne flute glittered on the stone floor like a constellation of fallen stars, each fragment reflecting the party lights. William sat hunched on the bench, his face in his hands, as the full weight of his wife's disclosures crashed over him, annihilating everything he thought he knew. The crowd of California's elite stood frozen in a tableau of shock, their faces shifting from disbelief to fascination to the dawning understanding that they had just witnessed the most spectacular corporate unveiling in state history. Cell phones buzzed relentlessly as people fact-checked Amara's claims, their expressions growing more stunned with each confirmation. William. Amara's voice held a note of genuine concern as she watched her husband's total breakdown. The predatory confidence of the last 20 minutes softened, replaced by a complex mix of vindication and unexpected sadness. He looked up at her, his eyes seeming to have aged decades in an hour. 91%, he whispered, his voice hollow with disbelief. You own 91% of California's major corporations. Give or take a few percentage points, she confirmed, though her tone had lost its sharp edge. The exact number changes with market conditions and new acquisitions. Gerald Murphy stepped forward cautiously, his investment banker's instincts overriding his social paralysis. Amara, the financial resources for what you're describing would be astronomical. We're talking hundreds of billions, $437 billion at last month's valuation, she replied automatically, though that was before the Pacific Solar stock split, so it's probably closer to 450 by now. The silence that followed was absolute. Trevor Kane, worth $3 billion himself, stared at Amara as if she had just announced she owned the moon. That's impossible, Bradshaw breathed. That level of wealth would make you one of the richest people in the world. Forbes would have. Forbes tracks wealth that people want tracked, Amara interrupted gently. Shell corporations, offshore trusts, Delaware holding companies. It's amazing how invisible you can become when you understand the right legal structures. Another benefit of all that strategic thinking, William assured everyone I was incapable of. She turned back to her husband, who was staring at her as if she were a stranger wearing his wife's face. 8 years, William. 8 years of you explaining basic business concepts to me like I was a child. 8 years of watching you dismiss my opinions. 8 years of being introduced as just William's wife while I systematically built an empire that dwarfs everything in this room combined. Elena Kane found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. Why? Why hide all of this? Why let him treat you that way when you had this kind of power? Amara's laugh was soft and infinitely sad. Because I loved him. Because I hoped that someday he'd see me as an equal without me having to destroy his entire worldview. Because I wanted him to respect me for who I was, not for what I owned. She walked over to where William sat, her emerald dress rustling. Do you remember our 3rd anniversary at Mastro's? You spent 45 minutes explaining why my suggestion about diversifying your client base was cute but impractical. The next day, I started assembling the financing for Strategic Business Solutions Group. William's head snapped up. You've been planning this since the first time you called me simple, she confirmed. Since the second time you explained compound interest to me. Since the 100th time you introduced me as your beautiful wife without mentioning that I graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Business School. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the magnetic pull of witnessing absolute power revealed alongside devastating emotional truth. This had moved beyond business drama into the unraveling of a marriage. Harvard. William's voice cracked. You told me you went to UCLA for art history. I have degrees from both, she said patiently. The art history degree was what I mentioned because it was safe, non-threatening. The kind of education that wouldn't make you feel insecure. Margaret Murphy was openly staring, her social conditioning completely overwhelmed. You've been pretending to be someone else for 8 years, not pretending, Amara corrected. Hiding. There's a difference. Everything you saw was real. My love for William, my desire for our marriage to work, my hope he'd see me as an equal. The only thing I hid was the scope of my capabilities. She knelt in front of William, her designer dress pooling around her. I could have told you about the trust fund when we first met. I could have mentioned that my parents left me with connections to some of the most powerful investment networks in the world. I could have explained that my simple questions about your business were actually market research. William's eyes filled with tears, the first genuine emotion he'd shown since his world began to fall apart. Why didn't you? Because I wanted you to love me, not my portfolio, she whispered, her own voice breaking. Because I thought if you could just see my intelligence, my worth, then maybe we could build something real. Antonio Rivera cleared his throat uncomfortably. Perhaps we should give you two some privacy. No, Amara said sharply, rising to her feet. Privacy is what allowed this to fester for 8 years. Privacy is what let William humiliate me tonight. She turned back to the crowd, her composure fully restored. I want everyone to understand exactly what happened. A man publicly called his wife too stupid to speak coherently. And that woman turned out to own the economic infrastructure that supports most of your lives. The implications were sinking in for the gathered elite. If Amara controlled that many corporations, she influenced everything from their investments to their children's schools. The Henderson Group acquisition of Hartwell Industries will be announced at 9 a.m. tomorrow, she continued, her voice carrying undeniable authority. William will receive a very generous buyout, enough to maintain his lifestyle. Assuming he's careful, William looked up, a mixture of devastation and dawning comprehension on his face. You're destroying my company to prove a point. I'm not destroying anything, she corrected. Henderson Group will expand Hartwell Industries, provide better employee benefits, and increase profitability by 40% over the next 2 years. I'm making your company better than you ever could have. The words struck like physical blows. William staggered to his feet, his face a storm of denial, anger, and a flicker of recognition of his own fault. This is insane, he said, his voice rising with desperation. You can't just own everything and not tell your husband. That's not how marriage works, no. Amara agreed, her voice soft but firm. Marriage works through mutual respect, shared decision-making, and treating your partner as an equal. Would you like to explain to everyone here how well you've upheld those principles? The question hung in the air like a sword. Around them, 200 witnesses to their marriage's public demise waited to see how William would respond. For the first time in 8 years, he had no answer. The silence stretched between them like a chasm that had taken 8 years to form. William stood swaying slightly, his face a whirlwind of emotions too complex to process. Humiliation, rage, betrayal, and beneath it all, the dawning acknowledgement that his marriage had been a carefully constructed fiction. You lying, manipulative, he began, his voice rising above the crowd's hushed murmurs. Careful, Amara interrupted, her voice carrying a warning that sliced through his building fury. You're about to say something in front of 200 witnesses that you can never take back, but William was beyond caring about witnesses. 8 years of assumed superiority had just turned to dust, and his mind was desperately trying to restore his sense of control. This is fraud, he said, his voice gaining strength as he found a narrative that cast him as the victim. Corporate espionage, using privileged information from consulting contracts to manipulate markets. You've been running an illegal empire while pretending to be my wife. Gerald Murphy shifted uneasily, his banker's ethics clashing with his fascination. William, maybe you should know? William's voice cracked like a whip. Everyone needs to hear this. My wife, he spat the word like venom, has been lying to me for our entire marriage, building some financial empire behind my back while playing dumb. Trevor Kane stepped forward, his billionaire instincts sensing the danger. This is getting personal. Maybe we should. Personal? William laughed, a humorless sound. She just announced she owns my company, that she's been manipulating deals for years, that my entire life has been a lie. How much more personal can it get? He turned back to Amara, his gray eyes blazing with fury and something that looked disturbingly like hatred. You want to know what I think? I think you're a con artist. A sophisticated grifter who targeted a successful businessman and spent 8 years systematically stealing from him. The words struck Amara with physical force. She had been prepared for shock and anger, but not for this complete rewriting of their history, casting her as a predator and him as her prey. Stealing, she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. I built my empire with my own inheritance, my own intelligence, my own strategic thinking. The same thinking you've spent 8 years telling everyone I don't possess. Prove it, William snarled. Show me the documentation for this mysterious trust fund. Show me how a woman who supposedly can't string 2 sentences together acquired hundreds of billions in assets. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the magnetic pull of a marriage imploding. Cell phone cameras were appearing, the exclusivity of the event forgotten. This was too historic not to be recorded. Amara reached in her clutch and withdrew a thick manila envelope. Legal documentation for every acquisition, every trust fund distribution, every corporate filing, all reviewed by Morrison, Clean, and Associates. I believe you know their reputation for thoroughness. She tossed the envelope at his feet, the documents scattering across the floor. 23 years of financial records, starting with my parents' life insurance settlement when I was 11. Every investment, every legal structure, every acquisition, mapped out in excruciating detail. William stared at the scattered papers as if they were venomous snakes. This proves nothing. Documents can be forged. William, Elena Kane said quietly, her survival instinct screaming that he was destroying himself. Maybe you should look at what she's showing you before. Before what? He snapped. Before I accept that my wife of 8 years has been running some shadow financial empire? Before I pretend this isn't the most elaborate con in California history? He kicked at the papers, sending them fluttering across the rooftop. I think you targeted me. Research my business, my social circle, my weaknesses. Then you crafted this perfect persona. Beautiful, seemingly innocent, just intelligent enough to be interesting, but not threatening. Amara's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. You think I spent 8 years of my life pretending to love you as part of a financial scheme? I think you're a sociopath, William said, his voice rising to carry across the party. I think you identified a successful man with good connections and spent nearly a decade manipulating him while building your empire in the shadows. The words landed like bombs. Several people gasped. Margaret Murphy looked as though she wanted to vanish. But William wasn't finished. How many other husbands have there been? He asked, his voice dripping with venom. How many other successful men did you practice on before you perfected the act? Because that's what this is, an act. The loving wife, the supportive partner. All of it calculated to keep me distracted while you stole everything I worked for. Amara stood frozen as the man she had loved enough to hide her true self for 8 years systematically destroyed every genuine moment they had shared. Each accusation felt like acid poured over their memories. I loved you, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own heart breaking. Through every condescending comment, every public dismissal, every time you made me feel small, I loved you enough to make myself less than I was because I thought maybe someday you'd see me love. Preston's laugh was ugly and sharp. You don't know what love is. Love is honesty. Love is partnership. Love is not lying to your spouse for 8 years while you build a financial empire. He gestured at the scattered documents with theatrical disgust. This isn't love. This is the most elaborate revenge scheme in corporate history. And I was stupid enough to fall for it. The words hung in the October air like poison. She looked at William and saw a stranger. The man she had loved had just reduced 8 years of genuine affection to a calculated con. He'd taken every tender moment, every sacrifice, and rewritten it all as manipulation. You really believe that? She said softly. You actually believe I spent 8 years pretending to love you as part of a scheme to steal your moderately successful consulting firm? I believe you're dangerous, William said, his voice hard and final. I believe you're a liar, and I believe our marriage is over. The words hit like a death sentence. not because she hadn't seen them coming, but because they came from a man who had just proven he'd never known her at all. She stood in the wreckage of everything she thought they'd built and felt something inside her die. "Yes," she said quietly. "I suppose it is." The aftermath of William's devastating words settled over the rooftop like nuclear fallout. The crowd of California's elite stood frozen in uncomfortable silence, witnessing the complete disintegration of a marriage. The string quartet had long since gone silent. Amara stood perfectly still in the center of it all, her emerald dress catching the light as she processed what had just transpired. 8 years of love, of making herself smaller to protect a man's ego, all dismissed as an elaborate con game. The silence stretched for a full minute before Trevor Kane cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should all know," Amara said quietly, her voice carrying across the rooftop. "Don't leave. Everyone should see how this ends." She turned to face William, who stood surrounded by the scattered documents like a man in the ruins of his own life. The adrenaline from his rage was fading, and reality was seeping in. "William," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "do you remember our wedding vows?" He looked at her with suspicious confusion. "What does that have to do with humor me?" she interrupted. "Do you remember what you promised me 8 years ago?" William's jaw tightened. "Amara, this isn't the time. To love and to cherish," she continued as if he hadn't spoken. "In sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do us part." She walked closer, her heels clicking against the stone. "You promised to cherish me, William. Do you know what that word means?" Gerald Murphy shifted uneasily, recognizing the energy that precedes either reconciliation or total annihilation. "It means to treasure," Amara continued, her dark eyes never leaving William's uncertain face. "To hold dear, to protect and nurture something precious." "For 8 years, I believed you meant those words." She stopped directly in front of him. "I believed them so deeply that I hid my own light to keep from making you feel small. I made myself less intelligent in public, so you could feel more important. I pretended not to understand business concepts I'd mastered in graduate school, so you could explain them to me." William's breathing became shallow. The documents around his feet seemed to mock him with evidence of everything he'd failed to see. "I convinced myself that love meant sacrifice," she whispered. "That if I was patient enough, non-threatening enough, eventually you'd see me as an equal partner instead of a beautiful accessory." Elena Kane was crying openly now, and several other women in the crowd had tears in their eyes, recognizing their own compromises in her words. "But you never did you?" Amara asked, her voice growing stronger. 8 years, and you never asked yourself why your simple wife always asked the right questions about your business deals. You never wondered how someone supposedly lacking strategic thinking could consistently offer suggestions that improved your presentations. She gestured to the scattered documents. "You never questioned how I always seemed to know which stocks to suggest, which real estate investments would pay off, which connections would be most valuable." William's face was a storm of shame, denial, and the terrible recognition that he had systematically ignored his wife's intelligence for 8 years. "You want to know the truth about strategic thinking?" Amara asked, her voice carrying clearly. "Real strategic thinking requires seeing what's actually there, not what you want to see. It requires recognizing value, even when it doesn't come in the package you expected." She turned to the crowd of witnesses. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed a masterclass in failed strategic thinking. A man who spent 8 years married to one of the most successful business minds in California and never once recognized what he had." Antonio Rivera found his voice, though it was hoarse with shock. "Amara, what happens now? With the companies, the acquisitions?" "That depends," she said, her gaze returning to William's devastated face, "on whether my husband would like to start over with honesty, or if he'd prefer to continue believing that I'm an elaborate con artist." The choice hung in the air between them. William stared at his wife, really looking at her for perhaps the first time, and saw a woman whose intelligence he'd dismissed, whose contributions he'd minimized, whose love he'd taken for granted. "I don't understand," he whispered, his voice breaking. If you had all this power, why did you let me treat you like you were less than? Because I hoped you'd love me enough to see me without having to prove my worth through destruction, she replied simply. I wanted you to recognize my intelligence, my capabilities, my value as a partner. I wanted to be cherished for who I was, not for what I owned. She knelt and began gathering the documents, her movements deliberate. But you just proved that even when confronted with evidence, your first instinct is to attack rather than to understand. William dropped to his knees beside her, frantically helping to collect the papers. Amara, please. I was shocked. I was angry. I didn't mean, you meant every word, she said quietly, not looking up. And maybe that's what I needed to hear. Maybe I needed you to show me exactly what you think of me when your ego is threatened. She stood up with the reorganized papers, her expression unreadable. You have a choice to make, William. You can continue believing I'm a con artist, in which case our marriage ends tonight and you'll receive the Henderson Group buyout tomorrow. The alternative hung unspoken between them. Or, he asked, his voice barely audible, or you can acknowledge that you've been married to someone you never bothered to truly know, and we can start building something real based on honesty and mutual respect. She looked at him, her eyes holding 8 years of accumulated pain and the faintest glimmer of hope. But if we do this, William, there are no more lies, no more pretending, no more making myself small to protect your ego. You'll be married to exactly who I am. All of it. William knelt on the rooftop, surrounded by the evidence of his own blindness, facing the choice that would determine whether their marriage could survive the truth. The next words spoken would determine everything. The October breeze stirred the scattered champagne flutes and legal documents across the Chateau Marmont rooftop as William knelt on the cold stone, surrounded by the evidence of 8 years of willful blindness. The party lights cast shadows across his face, highlighting the tears that had begun to fall as the full weight of his choices settled over him like a suffocating blanket. 200 witnesses stood frozen in the aftermath of devastation, their collective breath held as they waited to see whether a marriage could survive the complete destruction of its foundation. William looked up at Amara, his gray eyes red-rimmed and desperate. I don't know how to do this, he whispered, his voice cracking on every word. I don't know how to be married to someone who's more successful than I am, more intelligent, more powerful. The admission hung in the air like a confession, raw and vulnerable in its honesty. This level of emotional nakedness was not what they had expected from an elite Beverly Hills wedding. More successful? Amara asked, tilting her head with genuine curiosity. William, do you think this is about competition? Do you think I built this empire to prove I was better than you? She knelt beside him on the stone floor, her emerald silk dress pooling around her like liquid courage. I built it because you made me feel invisible, because 8 years of being dismissed and patronized and explained drove me to prove to myself, not to you, that I was capable of strategic thinking. Trevor Kane stepped forward slightly, his billionaire's instincts recognizing a moment of genuine transformation. Maybe we should give you two privacy, no? Amara said firmly, her eyes never leaving William's face. Privacy is what allowed this to fester. Everyone here needs to witness how this ends, either in honest partnership or in the complete destruction of everything we thought we'd built together. She reached out and touched William's face with gentle fingers, wiping away tears he hadn't realized he was crying. You want to know what real strategic thinking looks like? It's recognizing that love isn't about who's more powerful or more intelligent. It's about seeing your partner clearly and choosing to cherish them anyway. William caught her hand in both of his, gripping it like a lifeline. I see you now, he said, his voice breaking with the weight of recognition. God, Amara, I see you now, and I'm terrified of what? She asked softly. Of how badly I failed you. Of how many times I made you small when you were already magnificent. Of how you could forgive 8 years of being blind to who you really are. He looked around at the scattered legal documents, each one representing a business decision that dwarfed anything he'd ever accomplished. $400 billion. You control $400 billion in assets, and I spent 8 years explaining compound interest to you like you were a child. Elena Kane was openly sobbing now, her composure completely shattered. Gerald Murphy had put his arm around his wife, Margaret, both of them recognizing the sacred nature of what they were witnessing. The money doesn't matter, Amara said, her voice carrying clearly across the rooftop. The companies, the acquisitions, the empire. None of it matters if the person I love can't see me as an equal partner. She stood up, pulling William to his feet with her. But you need to understand something. If we rebuild this marriage, it's built on truth. All of it. You'll be married to a woman who owns more than 90% of California's major corporations, who influences policy decisions that affect millions, who makes strategic decisions that reshape entire industries. William's breathing had steadied, though his face remained pale. I want to try, he said simply. I want to learn how to be married to the woman you actually are, not the woman I convinced myself you were. It won't be easy, she warned. Your ego will struggle with dinner parties where I know more about the business being discussed than you do, with social situations where people defer to my expertise instead of yours, with the reality that your wife is one of the most powerful people in California. He nodded slowly, his gray eyes holding hers with new clarity. I think part of me always knew. Those perfect stock suggestions, those business insights that were always just a little too sharp. I chose not to see it because it was easier to feel superior than to acknowledge that I was married to someone extraordinary. Amara felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. Not forgiveness, that would take time, but the possibility of rebuilding something real from the ashes of their comfortable lives. There's something else, she said, reaching into her clutch one final time. She withdrew a single document sealed in an elegant envelope. The Henderson Group acquisition of Hartwell Industries. It doesn't have to happen. William stared at the envelope as if it contained either salvation or damnation. What do you mean? I mean, the acquisition was structured to give you a choice, she explained, her voice taking on the confident tone of someone accustomed to controlling billion-dollar decisions. You can accept the buyout. It's generous enough to set you up for life, and Henderson Group will expand your company beyond anything you could have achieved alone. She paused, letting the implication settle. Or you can retain ownership and accept me as a silent partner. My resources, my connections, my strategic expertise, all of it available to help you build Hartwell Industries into something that could compete with the largest consulting firms in the country. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the magnetic pull of witnessing not just personal reconciliation, but a potential business partnership that could reshape California's consulting industry. A silent partner, William repeated. Silent in the sense that your name stays on the door. Your leadership remains visible, she clarified, but honest in the sense that we both know where the strategic thinking and financial backing are coming from. She held out the envelope. The choice is yours, William. We rebuild our marriage and our business as equal partners, or we end both with dignity and move forward separately. William took the envelope with trembling hands, but he didn't open it. Instead, he looked around at the 200 witnesses who had watched their marriage implode and potentially resurrect itself in the span of 2 hours. 8 years ago, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the rooftop, I married the woman I thought was perfect for me. Tonight, I discovered that I actually married the woman who was perfect for me. I was just too arrogant to notice. He turned back to Amara, his eyes bright with tears and possibility. I want to learn how to be worthy of the partner I actually have, not the one I pretended you were. It will require humility, she warned. I'm learning about humility, he replied with a shaky smile. It will require recognizing my intelligence publicly, celebrating my successes instead of feeling threatened by them. I want to celebrate everything about you that I was too blind to see, and it will require trust, she said, her voice softening. Trust that I spent 8 years building an empire not to destroy you, but because I needed to prove to myself that I was worthy of being loved by someone I respected. William stepped closer to her, the legal documents crunching under his feet. Amara Johnson, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the rooftop. Will you marry me again? Not the woman I thought you were, but the woman you actually are." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had broken her heart and potentially just earned the chance to rebuild it. Around them, California's elite held their breath. "Yes," she said simply. "But this time we build it on truth." As William's lips met hers in a kiss that tasted of tears, champagne, and new beginnings, the crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. Not the polite clapping of a successful party, but the genuine celebration of witnessing something rare. The moment when two people chose love over pride, honesty over comfort, and the hard work of real partnership over the easy assumptions of a beautiful lie. Later, the society pages would call it the most dramatic wedding reception in Beverly Hills history. But for Amara and William, it was simply the first day of a marriage built on seeing each other clearly and choosing to love what they found.